What if you were the disavowed son of Elvis Presley and you were caught in this position, which is an absent father who is everywhere, an absent father who is endlessly present? And then I thought, just to make it a little bit more complicated, let's go with Elvis and a black woman so that he is a mixed race character, which would allow me to explore issues of identity alongside the pop culture.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. I'm Eric Senich. Before we get started, if you'd like to support the podcast, get episodes commercial free, you can sign up for the Backstage Pass from Patreon for just $5 a month. You can find the link in the show notes, or you can go to bookedonrock.com for that. Now on to our guest, Joseph Coulson. He is an accomplished novelist, poet, playwright, and musician whose debut novel, The Vanishing Moon, was selected for Barnes & Noble's Great New Writers Series and earned Forward Magazine's Book of the Year Award for Literary Fiction. Today, we'll be discussing his latest work titled The Prince of Memphis. In The Prince of Memphis, Aron Beale, a musician who claims to be the secret son of Elvis Presley and a black mother, faces threats and powerful forces determined to stop him from publishing his explosive memoir. Alongside journalist Odelia Jane Phillips, he embarks on a surreal, music-filled journey through America's cultural landscape while confronting family secrets, identity, and the enduring shadow of the king. Welcome to the podcast, Joseph.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Eric.
We have seen so many memoirs come out from musicians over the last 10, 15 years. Many get deeply personal and revealing. What was the original spark that inspired The Prince of Memphis? Was there a specific moment, idea, or a specific memoir that you read?
Yeah, not a memoir, no. I'd say there were two things. The first thing was really just the genesis of an idea, which was, I was thinking about, what's it like? The first thing I was thinking about, what would it like to be a child of, a rock star, any rock star. And then as I began to muse on that a little bit more, of course, I landed on Elvis. I'll come back to that in a minute, and thought about, the idea of what would that have really been like, to be the child of Elvis Presley. But then another thought occurred to me, which was, what if you were the disavowed son of Elvis Presley? Thinking I didn't want to go. I mean, Lisa Marie is there, right? Or was. And so, that wasn't a direction I wanted to go in. So what if you were the disavowed son of Elvis Presley and you were caught in this position, which is an absent father who is everywhere, an absent father who is endlessly present? And I thought, now that's something to work with. And then I thought, just to make it a little bit more complicated, let's go with, Elvis and a black woman, Aaron's mother, Clara Mae Beale, so that he is a mixed race character, which would allow me to explore issues of identity alongside the pop culture, because I conceived of the book initially as serial comic. It was my first two books were both tragedies, and I wanted to write something, that would hopefully at least make people smile occasionally, or or chuckle here and there, And but I also wanted to have a serious aspect to the book as well. I wanted to be able to say something about American popular culture. I wanted to say some things about rock and roll. I wanted to say something about American identity. And so it seemed that all of those elements were going to allow me to do that. So that was really the genesis of it.
Yeah, the novel couldn't exist without Elvis at the center. So yeah, what made him the right artist for this story, rather than a John Lennon or a Jim Morrison or a Bob Dylan?
Well, that's where it's a little more personal. I think I've been an Elvis fan since I was probably 9 or 10 years old, and so I was watching Elvis movies on TV as reruns, the 9 o'clock movie or something on Saturday night. filled with commercials and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. But that was where I first discovered him, really. And that would have been 65, 66, 67. You know, I was 8, 9, 10 years old, you know, somewhere in that neighborhood. Um, and then came in 1968 the what became known as the comeback special. But in my time, it was Singer Presents Elvis, you know, the Singer Sewing Machine Company, you know, with the Christmas special of December 3rd, 1968. And that sort of cemented my interest in Elvis. And you know, he was already thought to be among my peers, meaning my 11-year-old, 12-year-old peers. He was already thought to be something of a throwback, right? You know, it's like, oh, Elvis is, oh, what's that? You know, so on. But as I became a musician, I had the great good fortune of starting to play with older musicians. I started playing with my brother, who's 9 years older than me. He's a jazz guitarist. And but I wound up in rock and roll bands where most of the musicians, if not all of them, were anywhere from 8 to 9 years older than me. So I started playing when I was 13, 14, and everybody was in their early 20s. And they were the ones who gave me a richer appreciation for Elvis, the musician, and Elvis, the innovator, as opposed to, you know, everything else that he represented.
Have you had the chance to see the Netflix documentary on that 68 special?
I have indeed. Yes. Yeah.
I really enjoyed it.
I like to say I've seen them all, but there's so many of them these days that it's hard to keep up. But yeah, that was a wonderful, wonderful piece on that special. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a fascinating line in the novel. Quote, "The thing we didn't have before Elvis was a voice that could explain the two-faced freak show we call America." What does that line mean to you?
Yeah, so that's spoken by Moses Blake, right? And in the context of the novel, so I'll answer that two ways. In the context of the novel, he's talking to Aron about what Elvis brought to the table that was different than, as he sees it, the crooners that preceded him. And when I say the crooners, these are people who I have great admiration for and I love, you know, Frank Sinatra, Tony Bennett, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But as he has it, as Moses Blake has it in the novel, they were living in an easy listening world, you know, as if to say, you know, everything's great, everything's fine. Let's just pick ourselves up and move on to the next day, that kind of thing. And their music, arguably anyway, was not so much a music of any kind of social consciousness, right? It was the Great American Songbook. Maybe some of that came in here and there, and they themselves may have been activists, but it wasn't necessarily apparent in the music that they chose. Elvis comes along, and he immediately, because of his style, because he had absorbed Black culture and Black music to the extent that he had, living in Memphis and listening to gospel, listening to rhythm and blues, listening to blues, you know, he immediately captures sort of the joy and discovery and the you know, the kind of abandon that music represents for him and for others. And then at the same time, he brings white gospel into it. He brings country music, right? And you know, his voice, which people early on, you know, thought he was Black when they first heard him on radio stations and stuff. His voice seemed to call out, it seems to me, this kind of, you know, here we are living in this late 50s post-war Eisenhower-esque landscape in which we still are observing Jim Crow and other stuff. And Elvis is kind of trying to move that needle, you know. He's trying to say, hey, look, you know, this is the two-faced freak show. Is how do we reconcile the fact that Black culture and Black music has such a strong anchor in American culture, with the fact that we're still trying to segregate it and push it off to one side all the time. And I think that, he was an early pioneer in this area, and I don't think he made a big deal out of it, but some of his favorite musicians were Black musicians, and Moses Blake in the novel is a Black man. And so he's the one who's kind of pointing this out, that now, some people have given Elvis a bad rap on that, but I tend to think they're wrong. I think that he was really trying to move the needle on that kind of appreciation, at least, and merge things in a way that hadn't been merged before.
The novel raises an interesting question. Who owns a public figure's legacy? The family, the fans, the corporations, or history itself? I was curious if that was one of the central ideas you were exploring here.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. My answer is history itself, right? When you're of course, there's all sorts of legalities involved. And in fact, I had to grapple with when I was conceiving the book, I knew that if I actually made Elvis a character in the conventional sense, and you know what I mean, Eric. In other words, if Elvis walked into a scene, Elvis Presley walks into the bar and says something to Aron or says something to Odelia or any of the other characters in the book, and and therefore now he is an active fiction in the book. That's a violation of copyright. I can't appropriate Elvis as character. Okay. That would be, if Graceland wanted to, or somebody wanted to, they could come along and try to sue me. It probably would be good for the book if they did that.
Yeah,
but,
right. The publicity.
Yeah.
But this is the area of book writing that can get interesting, but frustrating, the copyright.
But then I thought, but really what I wanted was he's the absent father who is endlessly present, right? So I began to realize, no, Aron has to experience his father the way you and I would. He experiences his father like a fan. It's from that distance. Well, now when you do that, Elvis is a historical figure. He belongs to history. You can write, Yale Doctorow could have written a book about this era. And if he wanted to, he could report something about, and Elvis went to New York and was preparing to get on the Ed Sullivan Show. Well, it's just a historical fact. You can put those references into your fiction and you're not in violation of anything. So that's the way I did it. In other words, what we see through Aron's eyes is his experience of Elvis, which is not that much different than anyone else's experience of Elvis, in the sense of that distance and Elvis as a historic figure.
Tell us about Aron Beale. Was there a particular person, musician, or life experience that influenced the creation of his character? Or, having just said that now, I'm wondering, does he represent us, the reader, the person who's reading?
Yeah, well, for me, that's what it is. You hit it. He's not based on any particular person. Now, here I will say, because, anytime you're writing a novel, there's all this stuff about memoir and novel and everything. But, the thing is that in any story that you're going to tell, and this story is clearly fiction, there are things in here that couldn't possibly happen, right? So it's clearly fiction. But the point is, it's still drawn from a certain well of experience, right, in my own life. So I make Aron Beale, he's not me, but I make Aron Beale my age, exactly. I'm born in April of 1957, so I have him born in April of 1957. And, that was convenient because that's how it would have worked, and I wanted, meaning, Elvis in New York in 1956, before he is a cultural icon or a mega uber superstar. And the whole thing unfolds the Warwick Hotel in a way that seems believable. But then it worked out great because, Aron's born in 1957, and that's the year that Elvis strings together 10 gold records, in one year. So it's, it works out nicely. But what it did for me was it allowed me to use experiences like my experience of viewing the 1968 television special, which is a fan's view of it, right? But I was able to interpolate that. Or there's another section in the book in which Aron remembers going to see his father in Detroit at Olympia Stadium in 1970. Well, guess who was there in 1970 at 13 years old at Olympia Stadium with my older brother? That would be me. So that's the way, I was able to kind of draw from my own experience, my own life, the geography wherein I lived, while at the same time weaving a fiction around that. And, that's what novelists do all the time. That's not, they may not admit it, but that's what they do all the time because, Hemingway probably said, you write what you know. Well, you have to write more than what you know. That's the act of imagination. But what I think he really meant was you do still have to write out of your experience, even if it's not autobiography, even if it's not memoir, you're still writing out of your personal experience. Otherwise, you're not going to have the authenticity that you need to make the whole thing work.
Did you consider having Aron's secret being revealed earlier in his life? Because I thought it was interesting. The character's about my age, middle age. Was it always important that this reckoning happened in middle age?
That's a wonderful question. And
I think that's why I connected a little with the character too, because he's around.
Yeah.
I was born in 72, so I'm 54. So
yeah.
I think the character's like 51, I think. Is that what it was?
Yeah, because the fictional present is he's 53 actually.
53, that's
there,
right.
There you go.
Yeah.
Because the fictional present is 2010.
Right.
So yeah. But I think the issue is that, the way it's kind of laid out in the novel is he thought about revealing it earlier, right? He's in the studio with Byron Moon and he tells Byron Moon, this is when he's recording Midnight Candy, right, in the novel. And he tells Byron Moon that he reveals himself to Byron Moon, and Byron gives him the advice, don't go there. You're on your way on your own. And if you do that, the tabloids are going to take you apart and so on and so forth. So that was one device I used. And I thought that was also realistic because he's young and it turns out he's going to be a one-hit wonder, but he doesn't know that yet. And so he's looking to someone like Byron to give him a kind of fatherly advice in the absence of a real father, right? There's two fathers in the book, right? There's Byron Moon, who's one kind of father, and then there's Moses Blake, who's another kind of father. And then there's Elvis, of course, but he's kind of not there. So at any rate, that was one factor involved. And then there was this issue of, which I take seriously because I think it reveals something about Aron's character, which is Byron points out to him that, what's it going to do to your mother if you reveal this? I understand why you may want to do it, but what about her? And she's still alive, through a large portion of this story, right? And so that's another factor that he weighs, about not maybe wanting to. That's not something she wants, clearly, because it's not like Clara May has ever written a memoir or decided to go to the media or anything else. She seems content with, where she is. And so that was another factor. But yeah, I think the idea of a midlife kind of crisis, where we find Aron is, a guy who's a little bit down on his luck, right? He left music relatively early, kind of outcast as a one-hit wonder. And then, he has written a book, but now he's doing, but there's this sense that somehow his life is adrift a little bit. And he's looking for that direction. And that's what I think prompts him to decide, okay, I'm going to do this now. I'm going to write a memoir, because the book, and not to confuse people who are listening, right, but this is a novel which is posing as a memoir because it's supposed to be Aron Beale's memoir, right? That's the kind of thing.
Was his mixed race identity central to the novel from the beginning, or did that become more important as the story developed?
It was central to me from the beginning, and that's because I knew I wanted and I don't want to give this part of the way, so no, this will not be a spoiler alert, but that chapter, I don't care if the sun don't shine, in which we get a flashback of Aaron's childhood and the racism that was directed against him in Detroit and so on. That was something I knew that was going to be in the book somehow, and you don't, like, I don't work from an outline. So, it wasn't like I sat there and said, I have to have a mixed race character so that I can use that. It was just that I knew I was going to put that in the book and I didn't know where or how, but, that made that whole decision about having a Black mother and having a life in which he's trying to cope with being mixed race. That was going to allow me to sort of prepare the ground for that chapter.
And nearly every chapter title comes from an Elvis song, right?
That's right.
Yeah. How did you choose those titles? What role do they play in the story?
Well, some of them are, some of them are quite literal. I Love You Because is the title of one of the chapters. And I think in that chapter, Aron asks Odelia, why do you love me? And she says, I love you because, so it's just, sometimes it's as literal as that. Other times it's, they are symbolic at the same time. Right. And so, one night is one night at the Warwick Hotel, right? But then there are several episodes of nights, throughout that chapter that constitute, a kind of a sensibility of time passing quickly, and that kind of nocturnal world of the musician. I Believe in the Man in the Sky, right, is an Elvis song. And there's a moment there where Byron Moon kind of shows up out of the blue, meaning the heavens, if you remember. And so
you got to be a hardcore Elvis fan because those aren't the songs that everybody knows.
That's right. Well, a lot of them are song titles, right? So a lot of them, Mystery Train, Baby Let's Play House.
Yeah.
And Baby Let's Play House is the first chapter where we get a sense of the domestic life of Aron and Odelia, in the book. And so, that kind of thing. So.
Yeah, that's cool though, because those are songs that are already in your head because you know his catalog so well. And they come to you as you're writing and say, oh, that's going to be a perfect one for this. Yeah.
Right.
Joseph Coulson is the author of The Prince of Memphis. I want to ask, I still haven't talked about Odelia, that character. We're going to get to that. But Midnight Candy, let's talk about the song. It exists both as a song in the novel and as a real song that you wrote.
Midnight candy, midnight candy. Well, I'm a honey-loving man who landed in your jam. I love to hear the clock strike 12 for midnight candy.
Did the song inspire any part of Aron's story, or was that simply the perfect title waiting for a character?
It's the latter. It was the perfect title waiting for a character. Yeah. This wasn't planned either. This is one of those, call it serendipity, whatever you spontaneity. I'd written the song with two other musicians, Bob Schlater and William Relling Jr. Bill was also quite an accomplished novelist and writer, but sadly he's not with us anymore. But when I was starting to write the book, I just grabbed that title because I always liked the title of the song, and I, at the time, I asked Bob, hey, you mind if I use our song? And then he was like, sure, whatever, and so we just kind of went that way. And so, when I was sending the book around, occasionally I would, because, I'm getting ahead of myself here. So when we actually wrote the song, we made a demo of it, because we thought it had a certain kind of potential, and the demo, like any demo, was kind of rough, and but certainly good enough to send to a record label or to a publishing house or something like that, just as a model of something that might be possible. So at any rate, when I started sending the book around, every once in a while, if I saw that the publisher I was submitting it to had some interest in popular culture and so on, which was why I was submitting the book anyway, I thought, well, I'll try this. I'm going to send this and see if they like this as an add-on to the book. And some of them were sort of like, we don't understand this. What is this? Why are you sending us a song? We publish books. We don't do music. That was kind of
we're not a record label.
Yeah, we're not a record label. Okay, so you don't get it, right? So then, I submitted the book to Dreamfield Press, and I sent them the demo. They loved the book, and then as soon as it was clear that they were going to publish it, then I sent them the demo, and they liked the record as much as the book. So that's what really spurred the idea of, like, then we actually did a full new treatment of the song, and it's a pretty high quality studio version that you're hearing, and we've got some incredible players on there.
Yes.
David Rokeach was Aretha Franklin's drummer for the last 10 years of her career.
I didn't know
stuff
that.
like that.
Wow.
Yeah. So some incredible players on there. And that's mostly due. I mean, I am a musician, and I've had the great pleasure of playing with some great musicians, but Bob Schlater, who is my co-composer on the song, he's a master musician, arranger, and all that kind of stuff. And so when the book was going to get published and we decided to redo the song, he just called in a lot of favors. It's what happened. And it was wonderful, and he just put together this amazing team of musicians, and they really just brought the song to life. But I also give Dreamfield Press a lot of credit, because they liked this meta idea, that, like, you could read the book, here's the story of how the song is created in the book, and now if you feel like it, you can actually go and listen to it. You can, click on go to the website if you want to listen to it that way or whatever.
Does the song reveal something about Aron that maybe he struggles to express directly?
No, I don't think so. The way it's described in the book is it's initially reviewed as 2.5 minutes of sugar-coated sex, right? That's the way it's described in the book.
Because it was a song he wrote when he was young.
Yeah, he wrote when he was young. And I think it's not so much what it becomes, I think, later on, is Aron trying to reclaim that same sense of innocence. I mean, that's here, put a little foregrounding in, because I know you're going to ask me about Odelia in a little bit, but this is the thing, right? The notion of the love story, and we'll talk a little bit more about American literature and the notion of the love story. But at any rate, I think that the song, as he gets older, and he already, we have some scenes of him, right? He's playing it later, after he's a little bit older, and so on and so forth. And as it continues to survive, across time, for him, it strikes me as a song about lost innocence, something that he left behind,
like a doorway into his past.
Yeah,
right.
I like that. I like that a lot.
Yes, and it's also how he meets Odelia Jane Phillips. So
Exactly.
We'll
that's right.
Yeah.
And that was
she was a fan of the song.
Right. And that's a doorway, like you're saying right there. See, that when that happens, that's an absolute doorway. And yeah.
And she becomes more than just a journalist in the story. Tell us about her character, how they end up meeting, and that chemistry that develops there. And what role did you envision her playing in his journey?
This is an interesting thing, because she was there from the beginning, but in the earliest drafts of the book, her part was just not as big, and what happened was, as as I continued to work on the book, and you do a draft, you do a couple of drafts, and the book's not 100% there yet. At least that's the way I work. And you hand it to somebody that you trust, and you have them read it, and they give you some feedback. Okay, I'll take some of that, I leave some of that, and I do some. But she continued to grow as a character because I liked her more and more and more. Every time something stalled, I could bring Odelia into it, and she would immediately fire the scene and push the scene forward, because and she would say things that I didn't, writing dialogue is sometimes a very funny thing because I don't really know, and this is really true. You don't plan it, you just you're writing it as if you're a spectator to two people talking, and she would just say things that I didn't expect her to say, if that makes any sense to you.
Sure. No, it does.
Yeah. And then that was wonderful because it would surprise me. And then so Aron would have to respond to something, so I'd be surprised, and Aron would have to respond, to whatever she said that like caught him off guard, And so that was really how her character grew. But they meet because, Aron walks out of the Peabody Hotel in Memphis, and she's coming down the street in her Aunt Dolly's Mini Cooper, and Midnight Candy's coming out of the car windows, and it's 2010, and that song is a hit in like 1974, 75. So she's actually listening to a CD called Monster Hits of the 70s, right? Or something like that. And that all comes out, but this isn't something that happens to him every day. So, he just sort of walks up to her car and says, "Hey, that's me. That's my song."
Yeah, right.
And she sort of looks at him like, "Oh, come on, man. It's like, give me a break." Yeah.
Right.
So,
and he, in order to prove it, they go to the local record store, I think, or something. He's like, "I will show you."
Yeah.
There's like the 45, I think, or something.
That's
like
right.
that. The picture of them on there. Yeah. There's a significant age difference there, yet their connection feels natural. What interested you about pairing these two characters with that gap in age?
Well, I'm always fascinated by that dilemma. Okay, if two people feel a connection, but there's a large gap in age, and it doesn't matter, it can be an older woman and a younger man. It can be, an older man and a younger woman. It interests me because I just think there's a lot of tension and conflict that can come out of that and when you're writing a novel, tension and conflict is part of your emotional engine, right? It's one of the things that helps drive the book. So that's something that always interests me. I think the other thing is that, it creates this thing. What is she looking for in him? And what is he looking for in her? And because of that age difference, it's probably two very different things, right? And so that's another thing that I think is really, really interesting. I think to some extent, he's looking for renewal. He's looking for, a kind of redemption almost, of his life, a kind of trying to save himself from some kind of middle-age mediocrity. And, how do you do this? Maybe one way you do it is you connect yourself to a much younger person, that kind of thing.
Without her youthful ambition, he may just remain stagnant.
Yeah,
and just
exactly.
think, that's over.
Yeah.
What am I going to do? I can't
Right.
do anything at this point. But she's the one who's like, come on, let's go.
Exactly. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. She's still got that drive.
Right. That he needed.
Yeah. And I think that and this is where we get into Americana a little bit, which is, I kind of ascribe to the idea that the great American novel, whatever that is almost always a love story. And it's usually a failed love story. And, and you can, if you just want to pull out a few, from the hat, but maybe one of the principal ones is The Great Gatsby. It's a failed love story. People say it's about the American dream. The fact that it's a failed love story might say something about the American dream. Meaning, if we take Daisy and Gatsby as a metaphor for something that is either not working or problematic about the American dream, or if we think of that conflict as where Gatsby thinks the end justifies the means, so he can become whatever he needs to become to win Daisy back without realizing that if he oversteps into profound hypocrisy, he might have a problem. So those kinds of ideas, and I think that's another reason why I wanted that distance, right? If that makes sense. It's in my view, he is also looking for a world that Elvis once occupied that doesn't exist anymore in his time, you see. And I think that there's something, essentially, kind of sad about that. And, it's sad for everyone. In other words, it's part of life, meaning a world that any individual may have loved dearly, or found identity and place in it, that was powerful. And I'm not just talking about nostalgic memories, right? But I'm just talking about that sense of connection and place and everything. Well, we lose those worlds. Everything changes. We change and that world changes. I remember vividly what Detroit was like in the late 60s and through the 70s and so on. I go back there now. Well, of course, it's not anything close to and some of that is good, that it's not even close to what it was. And some of it is not so good. And that's always the way it is, right? But Aron, he's definitely looking for some part of himself and some part of the world that existed for him at one time and doesn't exist anymore, and somehow believes, and this is where you get into that failed business about the dream, right? Somehow believes that maybe he can get it back with Odelia. But going back to Gatsby, Gatsby says to Nick Carraway, no, he says something about the past, and Nick Carraway says to him, you can't reclaim the past. I think it's reclaim, but it may be a better word than that. You can't get it back. It's essentially what Nick Carraway was saying. And what does Gatsby say? He says, well, of course you can. If you got enough money and, so on, whatever. Well, you see what I mean? So that's to me, that's the rub, and that's the part of what's going on in the book.
Dude, that's fascinating, because that's something I connected with the character as well, because I have the employees that I have are much younger than me, but I feel like there's still a part of me in their youth that I connect with. So yeah. We have the sense of humor where we'll click on certain things, but then at the same time, just today, one of my employees is 23. He goes, wow, so you were born in what year? I said 72. Man, so you were the shuttle explosion. You remember that? I said, yeah, I was 14 years old. I was in junior high. I remember they announced it over the speakers. Yeah. It's a whole other world that they don't know. But it also brings me back to those times. But anyway, that's I think I find that fascinating. Now, there's also a Rod Serling aspect here with the haunted jukebox. I love this. The haunted It's a great addition to the overall story. It comes up early on and again towards the end of the book. If you could talk about the jukebox, and then where did that idea come from?
First of all, I love jukeboxes. And so, I'm old enough that they were in the world, when I was growing up. And, I used to drop quarters in them in restaurants and bars later and stuff like that, but even as a little kid, I could be in a clock restaurant or something in the 60s, with my parents, and my father would give me a quarter, and say, go play something, and I'd go over and, I'd be like kid in a candy shop, drop the quarter and, looking at all the titles. And of course, at that age, I didn't know what half the songs were, but it didn't matter. It was like, it was incredible fun, right?
All the latest hits.
Yeah, all the latest hits, right? So I always loved, and I loved the, old jukeboxes have a kind of style and engineering that's in some ways not unlike old cars or something, right? They really conjure up an era in a way that other artifacts maybe do not so specifically. And so I love them, just as that, just as artifacts. But I've always thought that the jukeboxes, even in their heyday, were sort of like haunted things anyway, because you'd play these incredible songs on these jukeboxes, and just to make it more literal in some sense, Sam Cooke gets shot and killed early on, right? And now here in the jukebox, here is Sam Cooke's incredible voice. He's dead now 2 years, and I'm playing, or 4 years or 5 years, and I'm playing a Change Is Gonna Come or something, which was released posthumously, right? And so the jukebox was always filled with people who were gone, too, whether it was so that in a very real sense, they were holding the voices of ghosts and people, living people, but it was all mixed together. It was like this wonderful salad, that was always available to you. And so that's, I think, the genesis of that idea. And then I thought, I just started playing with the idea that in the Prince of Memphis, what if I, we're at Ernestine and Hale, what if I made the jukebox sort of the arbiter of taste? So that's nobody's, dropping the thing. It's just the jukebox is going to play what it feels like listening to.
Right.
And I just thought, and that's where the Rod Serling part comes in that you're talking about, right? And then I just kind of ran with that, and things get a little crazier.
Thanks so much for checking out the Booked on Rock podcast. If you've just found the podcast, welcome. If you've been listening, thank you so much for your support. And make sure you tell a friend, a family member, share on social media, and let people know about Booked on Rock. And if you do like the podcast, make sure you subscribe, give a 5-star review wherever you listen to the Booked on Rock podcast. We're on Amazon, Apple, iHeart, Spotify, Spreaker, TuneIn, and on YouTube Music. You can check out the full episodes on video, along with video highlights from episodes, on the Booked on Rock YouTube channel. Find it at Booked on Rock. Thanks again for listening. Now back to the show. Byron Moon, one of the most important characters in this novel. He's a visionary producer. He's a mentor. He's a mad scientist. He's a father figure, and possibly a cautionary tale all rolled into one. He calls the idea of a black woman and Elvis a rock and roll reconciliation. Is he describing Clara May and Elvis's relationship, or is he describing what rock and roll itself represents at its best?
Wow, man, I really like the way you read. Can I just say that to you?
I love the book, so I think you can tell.
Yeah. I'm gonna have to hit you up for some copy, man. So anyway, sorry.
Yeah.
But the wow, that's an amazing question, and it's so full.
Yeah, because we know that the roots of rock and roll are in the blues and the black musicians.
I think that was the thing, right? So let's go back to Jackie Wilson, right? So great Detroit soul singer, Dogging Around, Your Love's Take Me Higher, all those great songs. He's one of Elvis's favorite singers, right? And they have a relationship through their adult lives. Jackie goes to visit him on the set of one of his mediocre movies, and that is Elvis's mediocre movies, like in the mid-60s somewhere. And there's pictures of him hanging out, on set and all that kind of stuff. And the issue is that Jackie Wilson said that, a lot of people put a bad rap on Elvis because they think he stole a lot of the moves and stuff from black music. He said, but actually what happened is that we actually copied him a lot. That's what Jackie Wilson thought. That was his thing. And I think, in the early days of rock and roll, which predates, a certain strain of identity politics and all the stuff that we deal with now, there was this kind of feeling that, we were all in it together. Now, that may sound a little bit naive because there's no doubt that some Black songwriters got left out in the cold, right? Because either they didn't own the rights to their song or whatever, the record companies managed to not pay them what they should have paid them. And so you had white artists capitalizing on their work and they weren't getting their fair share. And that's the least of it, probably. So we know that all that stuff happened. But at the same time, what you had a bunch of Jewish composers in the Brill Building in New York City. I'm talking about, Carole King, Cynthia Weil, Barry Mann, Gary Coffin, right? Jerry Coffin, Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, right? Who write Jailhouse Rock, who write Hound Dog for Big Mama Thornton. And, they send Hound Dog to Big Mama Thornton and she does a nice job with it, but she keeps it as a slow blues. It's a straight four slow blues and it doesn't do anything on the charts. And then Elvis picks it up and he does it about 4 times. He triples or quadruples the time that Big Mama Thornton does it and then uses his own, kind of vocal stylings. And suddenly Lieber and Stoller are making a fortune back in New York. And so my point is you can make an argument that early rock and roll is written by a bunch of brilliant young Jewish composers in New York City, sending their stuff, to the coast or to Memphis or wherever it was being recorded, along with people like Arthur Crudup and other of the early composers. He wrote "That's All Right, Mama" and stuff that Elvis recorded. And you got, senior moment. Well, he eventually becomes a preacher, right? But he's an incredible Little Richard.
Little Richard, yeah.
Yeah, Little Richard. That's who I was going for. Senior moment. So, you've got all of these people at the outset, whether it's B.B. King, Little Richard, they're all working, they're all creating stuff, they're all merging different styles. And a lot of people have made that it was more of a melting pot feel, that it really was trying to draw on all of these traditions and try to make something new and fresh, that didn't quite sound like the next guy. And so I think it's a combination of those things. Was there exploitation? Absolutely. But was there also kind of a spirit of like freedom and creativity and discovery that everybody was sharing? Well, a lot of those artists would argue or would have said that, yeah, that was the case. James Brown certainly felt that way about Elvis, and so on. So it's complex, it's nuanced and it's complex, and you have to kind of concede both sides. But I think that is the spirit of rock and roll. And when he says, to get back to your question, that rock and roll reconciliation, a Black woman and Elvis, it's symbolic, right? That's the way I'm meaning it in the book, particularly, Elvis, he had the Jordanaires up there for years, but then, in the late 60s, he connects up with the Sweet Inspirations and they're with him until the end. And I don't know if you saw Baz Luhrmann's new movie, called Epic, Elvis Presley in concert, which is the concert.
Oh, I did. The Vegas. I
Vegas
did.
Years.
Yeah, it's another
incredible.
Fantastic.
Yeah. And in that film, I think you can see almost immediately his rapport and the fun that he was having with all of his musicians. And all I'm trying to say is that, I don't think Elvis himself ever thought there's no evidence to suggest that he ever thought of his music as some kind of segregated thing. Sure, he had gospel white guys up there, but he also had the Sweet Inspirations. And on all of his big records from the late 60s and early 70s, they are front and center. And, and he was always telling the producer, turn them up, which is what we did on the background vocal for Midnight Candy, too, the song from the book.
Cool. Yeah, Byron warns Aron in regards to revealing who his mother is. Why is that?
Well, because I think he I think he says in that section, right, it's 1974, and the Klan is still fighting the Civil War, and this is not going to sit well, particularly with the what was then sort of religious conservatives and so on and so forth, because part of the whole text of this book, right, is this notion of Elvis religion and the what is the sacred text of Elvis religion and what that means, and as part of Elvis's iconography. And so the warning is, you're messing with forces that are way beyond your control, and if you want to go there in 1974 and say that you are the mixed race son of Elvis Presley, okay, that's going to get a lot of attention, but you're also going to get some attention from some people who might want to kill you. And that's the warning about the Klan. And then, I work that out a little differently as we go forward in time, right? But
yeah,
that's same idea.
Yeah, that's the Unus Verus Rex.
Unus Verus Rex.
Unus
right.
Verus Rex. Yeah, we'll get to that. But real quickly, before we get to that, the radio station, WAAX, feels almost mythical when we first hear about it. And there's this DJ who works there, Moses Blake. Early in the novel, Aron says to Odelia that he was my reason for being here until you came along. What made him such an important figure in Aron's life?
Well, Moses was the engineer on Midnight Candy, right? That's how he first meets him. And so he's the engineer that Byron brings in to get the cruising mix sound in the record, right? So that's where he first meets him. But for Moses, for Aron, Moses kind of represents a father figure who is generous and open-souled, and not potentially crazy. Not to put too fine a spin on it, right? But he's not potentially crazy, and so Moses sort of represents, in Aron's world, even though this seems kind of odd in the construct of the novel, he does represent a certain kind of stability, right? He's still there in Memphis. He's still playing the old songs. He in this kind of mythical station, as you say, and he refuses to stream, right? No, we're just going to go analog all the way, and he hopes for good weather, because on good nights his voice goes from Miami to Mexico, right? That kind of thing. So that's what I think he represents for Aron. But he also is a gatekeeper, right? The way I set it up is, one of the influences for me as a writer that I can never shake is Joseph Conrad and Heart of Darkness. And so I'm not saying that Byron Moon is Kurtz exactly. That's not what I'm aiming for. He may be a thinly veiled Phil Spector, but I don't know that he's Kurtz in Heart of Darkness. But the way I set it up is that if you remember in Heart of Darkness, Marlowe, the character who's going down the river to see Kurtz, he has to stop at a series of stations on the way, and there's sort of these supply stations and so on where bizarre stuff is happening, and things get more and more bizarre the closer he gets to Kurtz. And I'm alluding to something of that. There's something of Conrad in everything that I write, because this idea of the genius at the end of the river, the genius at the end of the journey, who is Byron Moon. And the closer you get to him, the world becomes a little stranger and stranger. Everything gets tilted, right? The closer you get to him. And Moses is the gatekeeper, but he's a safety zone. You see, he's a safety zone. And so that's what he represents to Aron as well, I think.
Find the Booked on Rock website at bookedonrock.com. There you can find all the back episodes of the show, the latest episode in video and audio, links to all of the platforms where you can listen to the podcast, plus all the social media platforms. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X. Also, check out the Booked on Rock blog, find your local independent bookstore, find out all the latest hot rock book releases, and before you go, check out the Booked on Rock online store. pick up some Booked on Rock merch. It's all at bookedonrock.com. He doesn't face legal scrutiny alone. You got the near religious backlash and the death threats. Now that adds real stakes to this story. Talk about this religious group, Unus Verus Rex, and what do those threats reveal about the power of belief and identity?
Oh, great question again. Okay. Yeah. So, well, they are essentially a cult, Unus Verus Rex. I don't know that I refer to them quite as, I think Odelia refers to them as that at one point, but I don't make a huge issue of that. But they're essentially a cult. And but they started, and this is the key, they started as something much more reasonable, which is they started as a fan club, essentially. Now, maybe a rather eccentric and extreme fan club, but a fan club nonetheless,
It's Latin for true king, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
They start out as this fan club, but, what ends up happening is that the guy who is essentially in charge of the fan club, he takes more and more extreme positions about what he sees as the sanctity of the Elvis story and Elvis religion and the idea of Elvis almost as a Christ figure. And one of the things that is not allowed in that particular, according to the leader of Unus Verus Rex, is, we certainly can't have an illegitimate child. And even though I think I'd have to believe Elvis had a few, I guess. I don't want to make any accusations, but it's hard to believe it never happened. But we'll leave that where it is. Not only can't there be an illegitimate child, but there certainly cannot be a black mother. And so that's in complete violation to the Elvis scripture as far as he is concerned. So what you have is this idea of religious fanaticism, and partly what I'm doing is a send-up, of the way I see extreme evangelical expressions and so on in our culture and the condemnation that they bring upon people. And the fact that when things become increasingly extreme, they become increasingly absurd and ugly and dangerous and destructive. And so that's the serious critique on it. And then, of course, all this absurdist stuff happens around Unus Verus Rex, which, so you've got this, I'm hoping, some kind of a balance between the social criticism and the entertainment value of the story itself, right? That kind of thing.
Well, they break into the apartment, right? There's the chapter where Aron and Odelia find out their Detroit apartment was broken into by somebody from the group. The intruder doesn't steal Aron's manuscript or valuables. He steals a specific Elvis record, his Christmas album.
Right.
Why is that detail important?
Yeah. He steals the LOC 1035.
Right.
Which in 1957, the year Aron is born, it's issued as a gatefold for only 1 year. The next year, they'll change the cover and it'll be a single pocket LP. But the gatefold in 1957 has like a booklet of photos from Jailhouse Rock inside. But the reason that they take that album is not only because that is a kind of perennially rare album, particularly in great condition. I mean, you can look it up on eBay if you want. You'll see them. Most of them are trashed. The spine is a mess and, everything else. But to get one in really, really good condition is difficult. And but that's not the reason they take it. They take it because side B, side A is the kind of secular Christmas music, White Christmas, et cetera, et cetera. Side B is the gospel side, and essentially, religious songs, Peace in the Valley and so on. But, within the context of Christmas. And so the idea is that they sort of take that record as, I think Odelia says it in the book. She says, they want you to know that they can get to the things that you love best whenever they want. which is this very rare record, but also it's the one that signifies what they're after, which is the purity of the Elvis scripture. No, this is Elvis at his spiritual best, so on and so forth. And so there's a kind of dual symbolism there about why I chose that record.
And let's get to the final question, which is the end of the novel where Aron is remembering the people who shaped him: Moses, Byron Moon, Clara May, Elvis, and Odelia. And it ends not with answers, but with Aron thinking about the people who shaped him.
Yeah.
And we'll leave it at that. We don't want to give away too much, but is our identity ultimately built not from facts, but from relationships and memories?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's beautiful, Eric. And I think that's right. I mean, that's how I think our identity is absolutely built. I mean, sure, there are facts in your experience, right? Something let's just make it very concrete. You're in a bad car accident when you're 16 years old or something, that's a fact of your experience. And it's probably something you're always going to remember, right? And that becomes part of your identity. And we have many things like that as we go through life. But in the end, those are not the things that if you strung together a whole list of facts from your life, those would not be the things that you would count necessarily as central to the formation of your identity. I think it's more complicated than that. Those experiences play into it, but it's going to be, who those influences were. Like if I'm going to speak for myself, I was very blessed with the fact that from a very young age, my father was not very accessible. He's born in 1917. He's Depression era. And he was not a man who spoke much about his feelings. He had a lot of feelings, trust me, but he was not a man who spoke about them very much. And so I was very blessed with having teachers from a relatively young age who seemed to think I had some kind of potential to do something, it was me, whatever it was. And they became sort of at various intervals in my education, father figures to me very often. And not exclusively, but a couple of them for sure. And that, it's that kind of thing, right? That makes it more complex, because I would not be the person that I am had I not met Steve Tudor, who was a professor at Wayne State University when I was an undergraduate, and he taught me how to sail, and he basically taught me how to be a writer ultimately, and a poet, and there were others in graduate school, the same thing. John Logan, Robert Creeley, others that I had who were amazing teachers. They were so incredibly generous. And that's why a character like Moses Blake exists in my book, because very often what I'm doing from my own experience is I'm like, Moses Blake is the teacher. He's the generous one. He's the one who actually cares what happens to Aron, and great teachers, that's what they do actually. They actually care about what happens to their students. And so, it's all of a piece in my mind.
The Booked on Rock podcast is part of the Boneless Podcasting Network. If you're a fan of classic rock and classic film like I am, go to boneless.lovable.app to find over 20 great shows there. That's boneless.lovable.app, or just go to bookedonrock.com, the Boneless Podcasting Network. It is what you want it to be. Listen with confidence. He's determined to publish this explosive memoir. What becomes of that memoir? Find out. September 15, is that the release date?
Yeah, the release date is September 15.
Can people pre-order now?
I think pre-orders are going to be available around August 1st, or early in August pre-orders will be available. Yeah.
Not too far.
That's what I'm told by the publisher anyway.
Okay. But what people could do in the meantime is go to your website, because pretty much everything is there, right? And the song Midnight Candy is there. The information on the book. So they could go to josephcoulson.com.
Absolutely. Yeah. And they can also go to dreamfieldpress.com because there's a lot of information there. Some of it's duplicated, but there's some additional information there as well. So either way is going to work.
All right. Put both links in the show notes, and that's Joseph, COULSON.com. Joseph, thank you so much for coming on. Really enjoyed the book and look forward to hearing what people think about it when it comes out in September. But we'll end this episode by playing some more of your song, Midnight Candy. And Joseph, thank you.
Yeah, that's great. And thanks so much for having me. And thanks for being such a careful reader of the book. I'm not sure people realize, but when you're a writer, it's an incredible privilege to be read well. And to be read well is by someone who's asking me questions that reveal immediately that they've read the book deeply and that they get a profound sense of the book's intention. And it just leads to this, it's exciting for me because it's like this wonderful affirmation. So I just want to thank you for that and for being good at what you do, really good at what you do.
Thank you. That means
really
a lot to me.
It.
Yeah, it means a lot to me because I know how hard it is and the time put into writing these books. So I really appreciate it. All right, Joseph, thank you.
You bet. You take good care.
That's it. It's in the books.